Hello everyone. In this talk, I'm going to present our work, The Bleeding Wall, a hematologic examination of the Great Firewall. In this work, we identified an out-of-bound read vulnerability in one of the Great Firewall's DNS packet injectors. It allowed us to exfiltrate parts of the Great Firewall's memory. The leaked data contained China's international traffic flowing through the backbone networks, as well as stack frames. We analyzed the sensitive information and inferred the characteristics of the Great Firewall's processes. Moreover, we proposed several possible attacks with this vulnerability. In the end, we discussed the new attack surface exposed by Bleeding Wall. To begin with, let's have a quick look at the Great Firewall of China, the most famous and infamous online censor. It inspects and intercepts the network traffic of over 1 billion netizens every day, blocking any content which the Chinese government thinks may challenge its authority or be harmful to its people. The Great Firewall has evolved a lot since its birth. The detection methods range from simple keyword matching, to deep packet inspection, active probing, and entropy-based traffic identification. When it determines a host is serving sensitive data, it may ban the IP address, port, or inject TCP reset to kill the connection. For DNS queries for sensitive domains like Google, it injects forged responses to tell the client a wrong IP address. There have been several global incidents related to the Great Firewall. In 2010, the Great Firewall poisoned DNS servers outside China, affecting domains like YouTube and Facebook. In 2014, the Great Firewall poisoned 2/3 of domestic websites, causing the largest internet outage in China. There are other incidents believed to be related to sensors co-located with the Great Firewall. In 2013, the SSL certificate for GitHub was forged to launch man-in-the-middle attacks. In 2015, 2017, and 2019, a system called Great Cannon hijacked JS scripts to launch DDoS attacks. However, despite its profound influence on the Internet, it is difficult to observe the Great Firewall directly. The Great Firewall is deployed in the international Internet exchange points in China, namely 3 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. It works in an on-path manner. The network traffic is copied from the backbone cables, so the Great Firewall won't become a bottleneck or affect the Internet even if it's down. It doesn't have public IPs either, so it's not publicly accessible. To make things worse, most packets from the Great Firewall are very simple, predominantly TCP reset and forged DNS responses. Complex packets like those for active probing are hard to control. Previous measurement works focused on studying the expected behaviors, like the DNS poisoning policies, or leveraged side channels, like the IP ID or TTL fields of the packets. But in this work, we found it feasible to perform more proactive measurements and even launch attacks leveraging the Great Firewall's implementation flaws. Here comes the Bleeding Wall vulnerability. Before diving into the vulnerability, we should have a closer look at the DNS censorship of the Great Firewall. It inspects all DNS queries at port 53 on both IPv4 and IPv6, and when the domain matches the block list, it forges a response pointing to a wrong address. Because the Great Firewall is closer to the user, the forged response comes earlier than the genuine response. The Great Firewall has 3 packet injectors for DNS poisoning, each with different block lists and IP pools, and the total number of blocked domains is more than 500,000. The censorship is bidirectional. It means if you query Google at any IP address across the Great Firewall, you get a spoofed response from it. It's worth noting that it only poisons DNS over UDP. For queries over TCP, it simply injects TCP reset to break the connections. Then, we need a general understanding of the wire format of the DNS protocol. In DNS packets, domains are represented as series of labels, divided by dot. Each label is prepended with a byte denoting its length. For example, the label www is represented as byte 3, followed by 3 Ws. A null terminator indicates the end of the domain. The RFCs of DNS stated many security considerations for parsing the wire format, such as, the parser should check whether the length field exceeds the packet. Bleeding Wall was caused by similar parsing flaws. One of the DNS packet injectors of the Great Firewall violated several security principles. The first flaw is that it did not strictly check the format of DNS requests, possibly for faster processing. It responded to any queries containing a blocked domain regardless of the type and class fields. When these fields were nonsense, it blindly copied them in the response, while returning an IPv4 address anyway. Even more interestingly, it responded to malformed queries without these two fields. In this case, it copies 4 bytes out of bound. These two fields in the response were from the Great Firewall's memory beyond our packet. The second flow was fatal. The vulnerable injector did not check the length fields of the labels. If we further changed the null terminator to FF, which denoted a label of 255 bytes, the packet injector would continue copying the memory beyond the query, until it reached the maximum size. In this way, we could dump a small part of the Great Firewall's memory, through such crafted queries. Therefore, we developed 2 formats of payload for this vulnerability. The first format, as shown just now, was to overflow the last label. We changed the null terminator to FF, indicating a label of 255 bytes. The second format, however, was to overflow the first label. We then used the string literal of a sensitive domain, instead of labels. The injector converts the domain name to strings before matching the block list, so it could also trigger the censorship, although it was not a legitimate representation of domains in the DNS protocol. Because the packet injector limited the size of the responses, we could leak 1 more byte with format 2. And, as we will show later, payloads in format 2 had a higher success rate. We further experimented different delivery methods. The first method is straightforward. We could just send plain UDP packets to deliver the crafted queries. With this method, the leaked data usually looked like network traffic flowing through the Great Firewall. The picture illustrates a sample leak, which contains an HTTP request to a favicon. But clear text traffic was rare because of the popularity of encryption. In many cases, we couldn't decipher the leaked content. The second method is to split the payload into IP fragments. The Great Firewall is capable of assembling IP fragments. When we sent the crafted query in 2 IP fragments, the leaked data usually included a domain, amid null characters and unknown data. We suspect such data came from the program responsible for assembling the fragments. Not all block domains could trigger this vulnerability. If a domain did not work, we won't receive any forged response. To figure out what domains could trigger Bleeding Wall, we tested over 390,000 block domains from GFWatch 16 times. Among all the domains, 3233 triggered the vulnerability at least 9 times. For these domains, payloads in format 2 had a higher overall success rate. The shorted domains were several 4-letter domains, and they only worked in format 2. We also had some other findings presented in the paper. Without access to the Great Firewall source code or binaries, we couldn't determine the exact reason for these discrepancies and behaviors. Nevertheless, we chose the 4-letter domains and format 2 in later measurements, in order to improve the efficiency. In addition, we have to note there were many limitations in exploiting this vulnerability. The first one is the small leak size. The vulnerable packet injector limited the maximum size of forged responses, which is 158 bytes. Excluding the header and trailer, the effective data size in each leak was merely 124 bytes. Second, we could only extract the memory following our payload. We couldn't specify the memory location to dump. Furthermore, the Great Firewall load balances the traffic to different nodes. As a result, we could not dump the memory from one node for long-term observation. But even with these restrictions, we still had a good chance to observe various aspects of the Great Firewall. In the measurements, we collected the leaked data for analysis. We set up 8 observation sites in 5 countries to cover different ISPs in different internet exchange points. Unfortunately, we did not collect enough data for Beijing and CERNET, the ISP for Chinese colleges and research institutes. Because the Great Firewall became aware of this vulnerability and started patching it before we started our formal measurements. We will present the detailed update process soon. We also set extra restrictions based on our initial measurements. The vulnerability existed in both IPv4 and IPv6, but it was hard to control or analyze the IPv6 routes, so we only used IPv4 for measurements. Besides, we did not find much interesting information in the leaks with delivery method 2, namely IP fragments. So, we only used the plain UDP datagrams to deliver our payloads. Over a period of 3 days, in October 2023, before the Great Firewall completely fixed this vulnerability, we collected over 1 terabyte of data from over 13 billion exploits. After a sampling inspection, most of the collected data was non-duplicate. After analysis, we confirmed the leaks contained actual network traffic flowing through the Great Firewall. On rare occasions, the leaks contained stack frames. Therefore, we localized the memory location of the leaks, and found they were from the stack of the injector process. We further inferred some characteristics of the Great Firewall's processes with this insight. The majority of the leaked data was network traffic. We found many pieces of potentially sensitive information in the unencrypted traffic, like HTTP credentials. Finally, we recorded the process how the Great Firewall fixed this vulnerability. We verified the leaks were truly the transnational traffic by seeing our own traffic in the leaks. We constructed packets with a magic number and timestamps, and sent them from one of our observation sites across the Great Firewall. The destination was a random port of a Blackhose IP address, and the sending rate was 1000 pps. In the meantime, we exploited the vulnerability and collected the leaks. The payloads were sent to different subnets with the same landing ISP and city. The sending rate was 5000 pps. Over a period of 24 hours, we retrieved over 86,000 leaks with our magic number. This indicates the Great Firewall was truly leaking the data flowing through it. We also observed that we only retrieved a fixed part of our probing packets. The offset was always the same. Hence, we hypothesized the leaked data came from the stack. The Great Firewall copied each packet to the buffer on the stack for handling, and the leaked data was the remains of the last handled packet. To verify this assumption, we further assumed the Great Firewall ran Linux on the x86-64 platforms. And if the leaks were from the stack, there was a chance that the parent function just called another function, and the remained stack frame was leaked to us. In local experiments, we found the return addresses and stack addresses have special patterns. So, we searched for this platform-specific stack frame pattern. The result was positive. After examining only 1.5 million leaks, we already found 9 matches. The picture gave an example. The stack address was followed by a return address, and we can see many pointer-like data, possibly the pointer variables in the stack. Each address was 8-byte aligned with our payload, although the payload is not shown in the picture. This is not a single case. After examine all leaks, we found 16,000 leaks with exactly the same layout. Even the addresses have the same prefixes and suffixes, which is related to ASLR. In total, there were 38,000 leaks with similar layouts conforming to the x86-64 stack frames. And we did not find any leaks with the stack pattern on AArch64. We further verified the time distribution of these leaks. In our theory, we could only leak a stack frame if the parent function just called another function. So, when there was less traffic, we had a better chance to get the stack frames, and vice versa. It turned out the time distribution also matched the traffic pattern in China. We presented the detailed comparison in the paper. We then performed deeper analysis of the stack frames. Besides the platform, we noticed the nodes had ASLR and PI enabled. This is the reason why leaks of the same layout had addresses with the same prefixes and suffixes, but different middle bits. Technically, we could count the number of the injector processes via this trait, but we did not collect enough stack frames for that. We further noticed that there were no stack canaries in the stack frames. At last, we inferred each injector process had 4 threads for handling network traffic, because each return address had at most 4 groups of saved RBPs. We presented the details in the paper. Then, we analyzed the majority of the leaked data, the traffic going through the Great Firewall. This vulnerability effectively enabled anyone on the internet to eavesdrop on the transnational network traffic of China, which could leak a large amount of sensitive information. We found there was a lot of traffic still in plaintext, despite the wide adoption of encryption. With regular expressions, we found more than 3 million pieces of possibly sensitive data, ranging from HTTP credentials to email passwords. Although after manually inspecting some data, we found most leaks did not contain full credentials, and it's hard to locate the service without the source or destination IP addresses. The stealthy adversaries might still leverage the partial data for their attacks. This result also suggests that, even the DNS-specific sensor in the Great Firewall handles most network traffic, if not all. Here are some of the results. Nearly 4% of leaks contained plaintext HTTP traffic, and there were many credential signatures for various protocols. Now let's review how the Great Firewall fixed this vulnerability. It patched its nodes in Beijing and Cernet before our formal measurements. And on October 30th, the nodes in Guangzhou were patched. On October 31st, some nodes in Shanghai were patched. Finally, on November 1st, the Great Firewall patched the remaining nodes. On October 30th, the nodes in Guangzhou were patched in 2 batches. Around 11 a.m., 2 of our observation sites stopped working. Around 12 p.m., 1 observation site stopped working. On October 31st, the nodes in Shanghai were also patched in 2 steps. Around 10:30 a.m., 2 observation sites stopped working. About 1 hour later, another one stopped working while 2 lost a portion of rates. On November 1st, remaining nodes in Shanghai were fixed, eliminating this vulnerability. The last 2 observation sites stopped working before noon. From this process, we can infer how the Great Firewall performs maintenance. Firstly, the Great Firewall is updated from the city with the least international traffic to the city with the most international traffic. According to public data, Beijing has the fewest submarine cables, and was updated first. Shanghai has the most cables, and was updated last, in 2 days. As for Cernet, it may be the testbed of the Great Firewall. Its Great Firewall is known to be separately deployed, and it has the least international bandwidth and limited access. Secondly, even the update inside one city is divided into phases. It may be related to the specific cables connecting different countries and ISPs. Also, in our observations, the updates all happened around 11 a.m. in local time. Now let's talk about attacks. As we have stated, adversaries might leverage this vulnerability to passively collect sensitive information. But we found it feasible to launch more proactive attacks. We'll take 2 attacks for example. The first is DNS cookie theft, which could help off-path attacks against DNS servers. DNS is fragile, and there have been many techniques for off-path attackers to poison DNS cache. DNS cookie is a mitigation to such attacks. It's a piece of data in the DNS packets to validate the servers or clients. But if the packet went through the Great Firewall, it was vulnerable to bleeding wall. It's at the end of DNS packets, so it might be contained in the leaks. The adversary only needed to trigger the victim to send queries across the Great Firewall, and continuously exploit the vulnerability to retrieve the cookies. Then, they could stack other techniques to perform DNS poisoning. In fact, after examine a small sample of 160,000 leaks, we already found 30 DNS cookies in the wild. This proved the feasibility of this attack. The second attack is reflective amplification attack, using the sensor as an amplifier to launch DDoS attacks. In previous research, the Great Firewall was considered a weak amplifier because of its simple packets. However, with bleeding wall, the amplification factor could be increased to 4. If we stacked it with routing loops, the amplification factor become over 400. The adversary only needed to find a misconfigured router, spoof the source IP to the victim, and send the payload. In our experiment, one payload with TTL being 64 could cause at most 119 forged responses. There are many benefits to use a national sensor as an amplifier. It has very high bandwidth, and the adversary may masquerade as any IP addresses across the Great Firewall, possibly bypassing IP blocking and source root validation. Bleeding wall revealed a new attack surface. Even on-path sensors can be compromised due to implementation flaws. If we look at the big picture, the Great Firewall is a very complicated system. There are multiple sensors for different protocols and co-located systems for in-path censorship. It is possible that these sensors have their own vulnerabilities. Beyond the Great Firewall, there are various sensors inside China and over the world. Their potential attack vectors await further research. Bleeding wall also shows the threat of sensors from another perspective. The sensors are everywhere, and they usually lack external audits, so their security is questionable. However, they are running on critical paths. As we already showed, even one vulnerability of the Great Firewall could leak a huge amount of sensitive data, or serve the attackers. We hope we can draw attention to the data security risk induced by defective sensors. At last, we want to express our thanks to all reviewers and previous research, especially GFW Rev and GFW. Report. This vulnerability was inspired by a compression pointer bug of the Great Firewall, found by GFW Rev in 2010, and GFW. Report has a great write-up for it. Thank you for listening to this talk.